next speaker is Steve Meacham. He's the organizing coordinator at City Life, also known as La Vida Urbana. Meacham has been an organizer since 1972. He first started as a community organizer in Cambridge, then went to work in the Quincy shipyards as a union welder. In Quincy, he was part of many labor struggles against the owners' general dynamics and the poor working conditions there. And he joined the staff of City Life in 1999. Please join us in welcoming Steve.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be in Quincy and to see Abe and Sandy again and kind of think back to the days when I was in the shipyard here. And actually, even before saying that, I should say that it's also delightful to be working with Occupy Quincy. And since, City Life had one of its biggest rallies, we built a coalition that led a march against Bank of America on September 30th of 3,000 people, and 24 people were arrested in the ground floor. And it was that night that Occupy Boston jumped off. And so in the ensuing months, we gradually built up, a better and better, or better working relationship with Occupy as we went on, and have sponsored a lot of events together. Most recently, this past Saturday, City Life and the Bank Tenant Association Base and sections of Occupy, Labor, and some youth groups co-sponsored the Radical Organizing Conference, which took place at 1199, and about 230 people came to that. So it was very successful and showed the continuing interest of an awful lot of people in what is radical organizing, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But having said that, to go back to Quincy for a minute, I want to recall the shipyard. I just don't want to go reminiscing down memory's lane here, but I want to recall the shipyard for a minute because it's important for the analysis that I want to bring. We hear a lot about, these days anybody who fights for the 99% gets labeled with favoring the rhetoric of class warfare. And of course, anybody who worked in the shipyard in the golden ages of the 50s and 60s know class warfare. I mean, it was a very, very tough and brutal place to work. But having said that, it's also true that when I was in the shipyard from 1977 to 1985, 86, that it was possible to go into the shipyard without a college education, without a high school diploma, get trained on the job, and make an income that could support a family. My wife at the time and I both worked in the shipyard in 1977, and we were able to rent a place in Quincy Point for $210 a month, including utilities. We were able to buy a new car and pay off the car in half the time that the contract said. Both of us working in the shipyard, even though we were only making $5 an hour, was a union wage at the time, and allowed us to live reasonably comfortably, actually. And having a job that allowed that to happen, where you don't need a college education, you can get trained on the job even without a high school diploma, doesn't exist anymore. And I mention that because my time in the shipyard was kind of a transition point in some ways for the American working class. Since that time in the shipyard, in the last 30 years, there's been a sustained attack on the rights and social wage of the American working class. And I don't want to just throw that out, sustained attack, without saying something about it. I don't want you all to believe that or anything else, even if you do agree with it. I want to sort of defend it. I want us to think about it, because this is what we have to bring outside this room. And so I want to look at it this way. Even though there was all this class warfare in the shipyard in the 50s and 60s, and all over the country, it never goes away. Still, it's worth noting that there was this period after World War II, for about 30 years, when what now seems to be an aberration was that if you look at the income growth of the American population, and you compare the income growth of the richest fifth, the poorest fifth, the fifths in between, that the income growth in the 30 years after World War II was about the same, percentage-wise, for all those income quintiles. And of course, the rich people gained much more than anybody else, because you're talking about a doubling of their income based on a much higher income. But nevertheless, it's significant that all those quintiles had about the same growth. In fact, the poorest fifth had a percentage increase slightly larger than the richest fifth, if you can believe it. And yet, in the last 30 years, after the defeat of PATCO and the defeat of many social programs, we had a situation where if you look in the last 30 years, and you look at the same 5 quintiles, that the bottom 60, 80% had no income growth at all, or very little, especially when you look at the wage, and all of the income growth was in the top 20%, but really even, as we all know, in the top 1%. In fact, the tinier the percentage, the bigger the income growth. 0.1% even higher, 0.01% even higher, until you get these figures of income now with hedge fund managers, where people are making $100,000 an hour, an hour. So that compares to, several of us would have to work all year to pay for that guy's salary in an hour. So that transition, that time I was in the shipyard, marks kind of the middle point between those two eras. And that means, in fact, to cite one other thing, if you look at productivity, I used to hear when labor was a little bit stronger and labor was trying to fight for a higher wage, we would hear that that wage increases not accompanied by productivity growth was inflationary. And that was all right with us because we were trying to take back some of that wealth from the rich. But even the people who are defending capitalism would say, you want more wages, increase productivity. In the last 30 years, productivity, how many widgets I can make an hour, has increased quite a bit, which means that the social labor of all of the American people put together has created quite a bit of wealth. It's just that all that wealth has gone, pretty much all of it has gone to the top 1%. Now, of course, we fight against that because we feel the effects as the 99% who are not getting the money. We feel the effects of struggling to make ends meet, and we try to defend our people and fight for more. But it's worth noting that on the other end, the people who have all the money and are sitting on piles of cash, this creates a systemic problem that leads to the foreclosure crisis. And that systemic problem is they really don't know what to do with their money. They don't have any profitable outlets of where to invest it, because we can't buy what we used to be able to buy relative to them, right? And so what do with it? They gamble. And that's essentially what speculation is. They create the dot-com bubble, which then collapses. They create the housing bubble, which then collapses. And it's interesting to understand